Welcome to the show. We have a guest on today, Dr. Jason Staples. Jason is a professor at NC State University, teaches in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And I want him on this podcast because he's written a really fascinating book, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, which is a book that has a very challenging, a lot of challenging aspects, but I think is just a really fascinating look at a subject matter that I think we could always have more research on and talk a little bit more about. But Jason, thanks for jumping on the show with us.
Thanks for the invitation. It's good to talk to you, and it's also good to talk to somebody with some roots in Tallahassee, where I've not been able to get back nearly enough over the past few years.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed our talk about the Seminoles right before we started pressing record, and obviously we'll put a link to your podcast on FC football because there's a lot of fascinating stuff there. And I don't know, I mean, you're writing books, you're teaching classes, and you're like a genius when it comes to FSU football. So I don't know how you put it all in the schedule, but that's a remarkable output. But
I'll just try not to sleep too much is the main thing. Yeah,
there you go. That's how it works.
Genius might be a bit of a stretch, but I'll take it for now.
There you go. It's all for the marketing. But I read your book because I've always been interested with Romans 9 through 11. And one of the things that's interesting about that is, our church we're Reformed-ish, we're kind of like that standard evangelical, like John Piper kind of thing. And when you're in those streams, you're sort of like, there's like when you talk about Israel, you think about dispensationalists. You think about the secret third temple being built in Jerusalem. You think about all those, the Left Behind series, all these types of stuff. And then that's often a foil against more Reformed views of the church as spiritual Israel. And so the question of Israel kind of goes in that direction. But I always found that some of the Reformed, visions of how Israel interacts with the church and what Paul's doing in Romans 9 through 11, it seemed like it just kind of bulldozed over a lot of fine details. And I remember when I picked up your book and some of the things you were talking about, like one thing that always bugged me was the new covenant promises. One of the central parts of it is an allusion to the reunification of the house of Israel and house of Judah. And I'm like, wow, that's not in the background. That's like, when they think of restoration, that's at the center. And other dominoes started coming in, with the Hosea quotation in Romans 9. And how does that work with Gentiles and all this kind of stuff, the olive tree, all these fascinating things in that section of scripture. So all that to say, I found your book to be very, very stimulating. And I'm just curious, what got you interested on this topic? Because it is a really important topic, but I know you've spent a lot of time in it. And I'm just curious, just your own personal story with what got you engaged with the topic of Israel and Paul within the context of Judaism.
Yeah, it actually goes back to an undergrad class at Florida State. So when I was taking a class on the Hebrew Bible prophets with Bill Lyons many years ago, so that was the spring of 2003. We had to choose a specific prophet to focus on for our term paper, and I'd chosen Jeremiah. And that actually is the very thing that stood out to me when I was going through Jeremiah. It was this problem. And actually there was we used actually one of the textbooks we used for that class. So we used Abraham Heschel's The Prophets, which has been one of the most influential books on me, as a scholar. But another book that we used was, the IVP. It was one of the IVP Exploring the Old Testament volumes. It's, short little intermediate level introduction. And it was the volume on the prophets by Gordon McConville, who I think is, by the way, a very underrated scholar, someone that a lot more people should read. But McConville did a really good, that's a good volume. And there were a few places in there where he made some observations that I never really considered before as a reader of the Hebrew Bible, as a reader of the New Testament. And I remember, I think it was in the Isaiah. Yeah, it was in his discussion of Isaiah, where he's talking about the passages in second Isaiah, chapters 40 to 55 in particular, where he mentions that Isaiah talks about the restoration of Israel here and Jacob, etc. And then he comments that, but in the wake of, the exile 2 centuries earlier of the northern kingdom and the destruction of the northern kingdom, and then, this is in the wake of the scattering of all that, and then the Babylonian exile of Judah, he just sort of offhandedly asked this question. I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something like, but after all of this, who exactly is Israel? And that was a question that stuck with me. And then when I did my term paper on Jeremiah, I ended up focusing on the book of Consolation, which is chapters really 30 to 33. And it's focused on the restoration of Israel. And one of the things that I noticed there is that, first of all, the sort of centerpiece of that whole section is the New Covenant passage in Jeremiah 31, where, as you said, it's the New Covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And by that point, I knew that was standard terminology for the two halves of Israel, for the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And then I took a little bit more of an expansive view, broadened out a little bit, and went, wait, the beginning of chapter 31 is all about the restoration of Ephraim, the northern part of Israel. Ephraim is my beloved son, and this whole thing, the Rachel is weeping with her for her children passage is all about that. So that got me thinking, and then as I'm working through that material, it occurred to me that I was familiar with some of these passages because they were quoted in the New Testament. I mean, the New Covenant passage, Jeremiah 31 to 34, is the longest passage quoted continuously in the New Testament. When it's quoted verbatim, of the Septuagint version of it is quoted in Hebrews. So I knew the passage from the New Testament as well. But the thing that stood out to me was in the New Testament, it doesn't seem to be connected with the restoration of the 10 northern tribes. It's applied to the Gentiles. And why are they doing that? So that sort of opened up the whole puzzle for me, was thinking through it in the context of that class and really working with it in the prophets first, trying to figure out what's happening there in the prophetic books, and then thinking about how that then sort of is used afterwards and trying to square the various circles that came up in all of that. That's really where that started. And, in the process, when I was doing that paper on Jeremiah, my conclusion was that, ultimately the early Christians at least understood the northern kingdom as having been assimilated among the nations, and that this is why they apply it this way. So that thesis is there as early as 2003. And I sort of started working at that from that point forward, and pretty quickly concluded somebody needs to write on this, because I couldn't find any materials on this. Nobody had said this in scholarship that I could find. It's like, well, somebody needs to fix this. And, I just decided I'll do it. I'll jump in and fill this hole, and figured, 8-10 years from then I'd be able to get that out and then move on with the rest of life. And 20 years later, I finally got the main book of that project done. And, I've spent the better part of my life on it now.
So I remember reading through your book. I'm like, yeah, how, is he the first one to think of this? Like how, and I'm sure when you were researching, you're looking at all the different ways that they're trying to solve what I think is a fairly plainly seen kind of issue. Like you're talking about that all these passages, they're looking toward the reunification of the tribes, but who are these northern tribes? What happened to them, and why are these passages applied to Gentiles? So in your survey, what were some of the answers that you saw? How have people traditionally tried to handle this tension?
There have been a lot of options. So first things first, I'm not the first person to see this. So I think that's important to mention. There are actually a few sort of passing references in a few church fathers that suggest that they sort of understood this connection, but they just didn't spend time on it. And I have to go and look a couple of those up now. But I do remember coming across one. It was a 3rd or 4th century one. It's been a while. I'd have to remember where it was, and I've got it down somewhere. But I remember finding it and going, oh, wow. Okay. So this is, we've got evidence that people are still reading this way at least that late, and certainly that early, which matters to me because as a general rule, I tend to be very skeptical about the kind of interpretive moves that get made where it's like, okay, well, we've been reading this text for, 20 centuries. And, it's been studied over in the tradition, starting with people who were trained by the author of this, text itself. And, now that we're 20 centuries removed, I can solve all the problems and show you why nobody really understood this from the beginning. And I tend to be very skeptical of those kinds of readings. More often, those readings just are the sorts of things that demonstrate that the modern interpreter has different lenses that are not the same lenses as the early audiences would have. Maybe the most obvious example that's on my brain right now is there's a recent article arguing, it's a chapter in a book that argues that in Revelation, when Jesus, who appears to John and is giving the 7 letters to the 7 churches, says that he will cast the woman Jezebel onto a bed. There's been a recent argument that this is basically this is Jesus saying that he is going to sexually violate this person.
Wow.
Not a single reader for 20 centuries came up with that reading, but a 21st century scholar for whom that kind of language has a very different meaning than it did in the first century, that then is the interpretation. I think that's an entirely implausible reading for several reasons. But number one, nobody else read it that way, who was a native speaker, who was, within the tradition. So that makes me skeptical. So I'm not the first person, and I want to emphasize that, to say this. And there have been a few other modern folks, I think both in scholarship and then I think sort of in churches, sort of various groups or whatever. I've had people reach out to me going, I saw this 30 years ago and, finally glad that. So, it's not like, I came up with this, out of nowhere. There is something there, but in general, the early Christian understanding of this, the sort of patristic position on all of this, on understanding who Israel is and how this all works in terms of that. By the time you get a Gentile dominated church in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, they're not actually as concerned about the nuanced question of, okay, well, what about the restoration of the 12 tribes? They are simply reading the church as the proper continuation of and restoration of Israel. And they just all say like, yeah, well, the church is Israel. And that's just taken as a default. Now, the question is how you get there, right? And by and large, they don't show their work once they get to the 3rd century, once they get to the 4th century on that. It's just a settled question in the church. So that work isn't really shown. And what I'm doing to some degree is showing how they actually got there. Why is it that by the 2nd, 3rd century, this is where things are going? It's because this is the kind of argument that Paul is making. And then once you get a Gentile dominated church, that's how they would read it. So that becomes sort of the default reading for the majority of Christians for about at least 16 centuries, is just basically the reading that, well, when God, when the Messiah came, when Israel's Messiah came, both Jews and Gentiles together in the Messiah is Israel. That becomes that sort of default reading. In a more modern time period, especially since the rise of dispensationalism with John Nelson Darby and some others, you had alternative readings come in, specifically arguing that, well, no, Jews are to be identified with, Israel is Jews and not non-Jews, so the church is some other thing. This especially caught on within scholarship since the Holocaust, which was, it's a good reason to reconsider a lot of theological questions, especially given many Christians' role in that sort of thing, and the Christian anti-Judaism through the past 20 centuries. That's a serious thing to consider and it has to be something that we discuss. So by the end of the 20th century, it had actually become sort of scholarly. The scholarly default was that Paul understood the church as sort of an heir to Israel in some sense, but that he also held out hope for ethnic Israel, by which they understood that to be the Jews in some way. And then there are a variety of different ways that that's understood, whether it's, all Jews alive when he returns, whether that's all Jews alive throughout history, whether that's some Jews that, specifically get converted at the end. And there's a variety of different explanations for this. And all of them end up having problems explaining how that interfaces with sort of other parts of Paul's letters. And that became, that's become over the past generation really of scholarship, or last 100 years of scholarship, a big problem is how do Paul's statements about Israel, where he says, and thus all Israel will be saved, how does that accord with, there is no difference, right? So how do we put those things together becomes a bit of a problem once you start to define things the way that they came to be defined in the 20th century in particular, and then in early 21st century. What I'm trying to do essentially is explain how all that stuff makes sense together, and that Paul's not actually saying one thing over here and then another thing over here. This is all part of an integrated vision for the restoration of Israel on the one hand, and the fulfillment of the promise to the nations through Israel on the other.
That's a helpful way to put it. I mean, one of the things that I think is so challenging about reading Paul is he's not operating in the way that we like. Typically people come in, they have a sort of vision of Christianity, and then they go and read Romans, and they're not, you know what I'm saying? Like, but they're not thinking that Paul is writing in a thought world and a way of viewing the world that's very, very different from ours. And so, we have that new covenant promise, which is the basis of the church. I mean, the new covenant promise, and we focus on the new heart, the new mind, and that's great and that's wonderful, and the forgiveness of sins. But we put in the background again that implication of the house of Israel and the house of Judah will be, and think about the prophets, how often they view reunification as part and parcel with all those promises. And that must have been on Paul's mind. And so we mentioned a little about Hebrews, and with Hosea, and I pulled it up on Romans 9, where, Paul talks about those whom he's called, not only from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. And then he says in Hosea, those who are not my people, I'll call my people. Her who is not my beloved, I'll call beloved. And I think you may mention this passage. And I remember when I read that, I'm like, oh yeah, Old Testament thing, churches, Israel, the end. And then I remember being like, wait a minute, that's about reunification of the northern and the southern tribes. Why is he applying that to Gentiles? And then so I think it seems like in your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're arguing that the Gentiles are, in a sense, that missing tribe. I mean, you get there through a whole host of steps, but I think that's a very fascinating way of looking at it, where there is a distinction, but you still hold the continuity of the people of God together. And so maybe we could step back a little bit and just talk about, because you mentioned this a lot in your book, about understanding Paul within Judaism. And that's kind of like the first step before the other things kind of fall into place. Can you talk a little bit about that? What do we need to understand about Paul with regard as a Jew, if we want to understand some of these things in Romans 9 through 11 well?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the hardest things about this is when we're reading the New Testament, and in particular the epistles, we're not reading stuff that was written to us, right? We are reading stuff that was written 20 centuries ago to people who were culturally in an entirely different world, right? I just was reading a thing on Twitter where somebody posted up, the past is a different planet, and it was a thing about the probably 200 years ago, a man wrote in, started chopping wood with a woman's father. Woman's father's like, so what you doing here? He's like, I came to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage, whether you give her to me in marriage. He goes, well, she's 15, so she's a little young. He says, well, that doesn't bother me. And, about half an hour later, they walk inside. They, father helps them, do their vows and everything, and then he takes the woman home. That's a different world from the world we live in, right? For us, like, we look at that and we're all horrified.
Right.
But that's just the world that was that world, right? There's a whole set of assumptions, practices, and all of those things that are baked into that world that's different from ours. In the world that Paul's living in is even more removed. That, 20 centuries ago is a long time, and they're speaking a different language. Most of these people are familiar with animal sacrifice on a daily basis in their towns. If not on a daily basis, at least regularly, right? Think about how different that is from our world. So this is just a completely different thing. So we're reading someone else's mail who comes from a completely different background, talking a different language with all sorts of different canonical, sort of cultural understanding. So for us, it's very easy to sort of go online. And if you're sort of vaguely plugged into, Western media culture, you can go online and there's all sorts of memes or, you text conversations with people. There's all sorts of GIFs and memes or whatever that the meaning is embedded there in a way that all of us just sort of natively inhabit. But if you haven't seen any of the movies, listened to any of the music, watched any of the TV, aren't familiar with the sort of norms that go with that and the sort of canonical in the air material that is being pulled on for all that stuff, none of it's going to make sense, or it's going to be hard to make sense of it. They have an entirely different set of cultural canon. And for the people that Paul's writing to, for many of them, the cultural canonical material that is the equivalent of Star Wars, Marvel, popular music, and all of the television and everything else that they know to be entertained by, and all of that, plus their national history, their 4th of July type stuff, their paper turkeys at Thanksgiving, all of that stuff is wrapped up in their knowledge of what we would call the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and, sort of parabiblical material and traditions. That's all of that for them. So a whole lot of things can be put in shorthand that for us, we just don't have the same ears to hear that they did. Right. For me, if I said inconceivable, right, many of you start laughing, right? Yeah. Because exactly what I'm talking about. Right, I only need one word said a specific way and you've got it. That's from The Princess Bride, and it carries an entire set of statements with it that, okay, well, maybe he doesn't mean actually inconceivable. Maybe that means that, you keep saying that word, I do not think it means what you think it means, right? So all of these things are embedded in that one little thing. And for them, all of that is the same in terms of how they have scripture sort of embedded in them. That's just their cultural matrix. And so when he comes in and he peppers, he writes, and he's got little phrases in here and here and here that are really cleverly inserted 3 or 4 word phrases that are taken from a couple key places in the Hebrew Bible, they're going to know this. They're going to notice this, at least the more literate of them. And enough of those people are there that they're going to be able to explain some of this to the others. So that makes it really, really hard for modern readers. And this is why, like, when someone, if someone converted to Judaism, the last thing that's going to be done is for people to say, here's the Mishnah, go and read and you learn what it's like to be a Jew. Yeah, even if it's in translation, can you explain to me what the terumah is and like why it's talking about like who can or can't offer it? Like, what does this have to do with like what I'm doing on Shabbat this week? Just read the Mishnah. No, there's an enormous amount of assumed material that's there, and that's certainly there in Romans. If you don't know Deuteronomy, Leviticus, if you don't know Exodus, Genesis extremely well, it's going to be hard to understand Romans. Oh, and by the way, when you know those, you also need to know Isaiah, Jeremiah, the Psalms. You need to know Psalms inside and out, because so much of this is just embedded in there, and he's presuming that the reader should know this stuff. It's hard.
So taking all that into account, I mean, so when we look at, again, Paul taking Hosea, applying it to Gentiles, and just the distinctions even between, because I think a big key point you bring up is that Israelite and Jew are related, but they're not exactly the same thing. Can you open that up a little? Because I think that was a helpful terminology thing in your book that kind of sets the stage for where you're going.
Yeah. So, I mean, even sort of early readers of the Bible pretty quickly come into the problem of like, wait, who's Israel? Because when you get into 1st and 2nd Kings, you get this divided kingdom, and the northern kingdom takes the name, they keep the name Israel, and the southern kingdom takes the name Judah, based on the ruling tribe of Judah, which is David's tribe. And so, when we're talking about Israel, we could be talking about the full 12 tribe combination of all of them, or we could be talking about the northern Israel, the house of Israel, as distinct from Judah, as distinct from the kingdom of Judah. And both of those are used oftentimes in the same books. So that gets complicated. And then when you get to the prophets, and again, when you're reading somebody like Amos or Hosea, it's not giving you a history lesson of, okay, so Amos is coming here and he's coming and he's talking to this group of people who's not this group of people. It's not giving that full explanation to everybody. You just read Hosea, and it's Hosea's from where is Hosea from? Gath-Hefer, I think. I don't remember. No, that's
isn't he from Tekoa? Or
no, that's Amos is from Tekoa. Anyway, doesn't matter. It gives us a little bit of information on where they're from, but very few of us have it in our head of, okay, that's right over here, in this part of the northern kingdom and so on. One of the things that I do on the side periodically is I'll edit other people's work to make a little bit of extra money. And I was editing a pastor's book that was going to be published, and he was commenting on one of these prophets to the northern kingdom. I think it was Amos. And he was talking about, oh, well, he's prophesying against Jerusalem or whatever. And it's like, no, no, not there. He's talking about Samaria here. Right. But for a lot of modern readers, we don't have the way of differentiating between those. So when Hosea is prophesying, he's prophesying. We have to read that together with 1st and 2nd Kings and know that you've got the northern kingdom, which has eventually its capital in Samaria. You've got the southern kingdom of Judah, which has its capital in Jerusalem. And Hosea is a northern prophet. He's born and raised in the north, unlike Amos, who's from the south and then goes north to prophesy. Hosea is born and raised in the north, and he prophesies specifically. About 95% of his prophecies are about the northern kingdom. He prophesies about Israel. He sometimes calls them Ephraim. And he specifically prophesies that stuff about that people. But he's not talking about the people down south when he's referring to these. When he does, he specifies Judah. And so the thing to remember then is when he says, "You are not my people," he's not saying that to Judah. He's saying that to this other kingdom, not Judah, in the north, and they, for what it's worth, within a generation, get essentially wiped out by the Assyrians. Now, there are survivors. Naturally, many of them, become refugees in the south, but significant portions of that population of the north get scattered among the various places around the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near East. You have some foreigners that are resettled in some of the more advantageous areas by the Assyrians. All of that's happening. But the thing to remember, he is not saying, "You are not my people," to Jews. That is people from Judah, which is what Jew ultimately means. That comes from people of Judah. And so when you're reading Hosea, you have to understand that difference. Paul understood that difference, right? He recognized this partly. And you see this in rabbinic literature. They understand no rabbinic literature. No, there's not a place in any rabbinic literature where the "not my people" passage is applied to Jews. They know the difference because this is part of that whole larger framework. The question is whether or not, the people who become not my people actually ever are going to be my people again. And there's debate about that. You go to Mishnah, Sanhedrin 10:3, and there's actually a debate between two of the first, second century rabbis who have differing opinions on this matter. Paul has his opinion on this. And what he concludes is when Hosea says, you are not my people, and talks about them being taken out by Assyria and scattered and so on, Hosea means what he says, that this is essentially a divine divorce, and that those people from the northern kingdom of Israel are not going to be Israelites. And like their descendants, the people who are left, you're not Israelites anymore. You're not my people. You are not in the covenant. And Paul takes that seriously. He says that happened. But he also takes the second part of that seriously and says, well, but Hosea also says, I will then one day I will say, and the very place where it was said to them, not my people, I will say my people again, and I will adopt you again. And Paul says, look, we're seeing Gentiles being filled with the Spirit. How is that not exactly what Hosea referred to? Isn't this the fulfillment of what Hosea promised to those very people, the northern kingdom? They get assimilated among the nations. And now God's going to bring in the nations and thereby bring in what remnant of those people got sort of melted into the nations as well. And to me, it's extraordinarily elegant that that's actually where he goes. But all of this requires that we not make a terminological mistake that Paul himself does not make. And that's to say, oh, well, of course, Israel and Judah are the same. No, they're not. Judah is part of Israel, but it's not all of Israel.
Right. And so what commonly is seen as just condemnation of all Israelites in general is really just one subsection, and Paul would have understood that distinction. And I guess this is why you call it the resurrection of Israel, because there was a death. I mean, they literally stopped being a people, and yet the resurrection is through a new form, I guess you could say, through the Gentiles. And now, are you saying, though, that these Gentiles have to be, is this a subset of Gentiles that have some distant
I don't think so.
So
In the book, I specifically and explicitly argue against that sort of genetic position.
Okay.
The idea that, only genetic descendants of Israel in some sense have a way of coming in. And I suppose, the more predestinarian oriented people around there could, try to find a way to make that work. But I actually think this might be what First Timothy is referring to when it says when it rebukes people for spending all their time wasting all their time looking deep into useless genealogies.
Yeah.
Why are they so concerned about genealogies? Well, maybe they're trying to determine, and this is speculation, but I mean it would make some sense given this. Are they trying to determine who their long lost Israelite ancestor was way back in the past? And my understanding of this is that Paul basically understands it as Israel was assimilated among the nations. They melted in, right? So the nations become alloyed, as it were. And so now the only real way to get at that, part of Israel that God made the promise to is to bring in the whole alloyed bit. And it's not to melt that down and then separate out this whole.
Right. And so that becomes actually the way in which the Abrahamic promise gets fulfilled as well.
Right.
And so wow.
Yeah. So Israel was set aside. You mentioned the Abrahamic promise. It's not just that. It's also Israel was selected as a people to be a nation of priests. Right. They were to be the priests between the God of Israel and the nations, and to bring light to the nations. Right. And this is Isaiah. I have set you apart as a light to the nations. This notion is really still central to Jewish identity for religious Jews. That there is a responsibility within the Abrahamic covenant to bring light to the nations. But Paul's essential understanding of this is that Israel refused it was elected. It was chosen for that purpose, and Israel refused to obey to bring about that purpose. So what did God do? God said, you're going to fulfill my purpose anyway.
Even through your disobedience, which is kind of where he gets it. Yeah.
I'm going to use your disobedience.
Yeah. Right.
to bring light to the nations and to bring the nations in. And in the process, I'm going to restore and redeem both you and them all at once through your disobedience. And that becomes, sort of the theme to some degree of Romans 9-11 is how God has actually found a way to use the disobedience, the stubbornness of his own people for their redemption, and not only their redemption, but for the redemption of the whole world through them, even though they refused to be obedient to produce the redemption that he had set them aside to do. So they were elect, they were chosen, not for their own sake, right? And they rejected their election. So you know what? Their election still stands. He's still going to use them for the very purpose that he selected them for. It may not go as well for some of them in the process, but he's gonna get the redemption of the whole world out of it that he intended. And so then the nations come in. The God of Israel takes authority over all the nations because Israel has been scattered among all the nations. And now, since he has a covenantal relationship with those people, and he has promised to redeem them from the nations. Well, if they're inevitable, if they're completely mixed among the nations in a way that can't be undone, then, well, the nations come in too.
So this is, the rabbis are having a question, and Paul, and they're all, the question in Judaism is, how are we going to have a reunification? How is all Israel going to be saved, right? In that sense, if part of Israel has been assimilated into the nations, and Paul goes, here's my answer, which would be the right answer, right? They are coming in through these Gentiles. And that's a fascinating wrinkle there because, this kind of makes sense with in 11:28, Romans 11:28, regarding the gospel, they're enemies for your sake. I'm assuming he's talking about Judah there, right? Jews, right? But regarding their election, they're beloved for the sake of their forefathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So even though Judah is rejecting Christ, nevertheless, because of their status as the vessel through which God's going to bring that blessing, their actual rejection is still serving that purpose that God had purposed for them. Is that kind of, so? Because I've always been puzzled by that one passage.
Yeah, so I do think that basically Paul's principle here is the fundamentally prophetic principle that God's discipline is fundamentally at its bottom restorative. That it's that ultimately the purpose of that discipline is to bring about redemption. And Paul seems to be fully in keeping with that idea, that even for those who reject, and then their rejection it causes all sorts of problems, God finds a way to continue to use even disobedience redemptively. Now, the real question, when we come down to it, is the question of individual, if we want to talk about individual salvation. Okay, well, what's the fate? What then is the fate of any individual who disobeys or whatever? Is this become a universalism? I do think that Paul sort of has a kind of hopeful universalist streak to him. I'm not sure he concludes that that's where that actually goes on the individual level. I think he has a place in which the individuals who disobey are maybe irreparably shattered. But on the whole, the redemption is inevitable because God has made a promise to the whole people. And this is where I think even that section in Romans 11 that you're referring to has to be read in light of the olive tree metaphor, where the promise is that the tree itself, the whole tree, will be preserved, is going to be saved. That may require the pruning of some branches on occasion. Some of those branches are cut off, and it's possible that they be reintegrated. But whether Jewish or Gentile branches, whether natural or unnatural branches, if they do not persist in fidelity, then they may be cut off. But the reality is that they still remain those branches, and that never changes. And God has promised to save the whole tree. So how do we take that? Well, I think Paul at the end of Romans 11 kind of leaves it a little bit open, but I think what he is emphasizing is the general redemptive quality of how even God's discipline works. That when northern Israel is cast out among the nations as a rejected vessel, to use the language of Hosea there, that even after that, even after they're shattered, even after the vessel is irreparably broken, that vessel is actually not fully rejected, because now it's being brought back in a different form. So even that has redemptive purpose. That, I think, is a huge part of what he's doing in Romans 9-11.
So are you saying that, because you mentioned he's not explicitly being, like, it doesn't necessarily have to lead to a kind of universalism? It seems like you're saying no, but there are aspects in which I guess he's hopeful.
Yeah, I think so. I do not, at least at this stage of my life, I don't read Paul as a full universalist on the individual level. I don't see that as where he goes. But I do think, if you look at his hopes for his ministry, he says he preaches, and he makes much of his ministry in order that, in the hopes that he might save some. Right? Now, the sum there, I think, is telling. He doesn't say, in order to, I might save all. But I think he holds out hope. I think he's someone who has such faith in the God of Israel as the God who brings life from the dead, that death itself is not necessarily the end of all this. And that God will have mercy on who he has mercy. And, Paul's going to preach his message, and that this is how God is showing his mercy. But I do think he's got, he's putting that sort of point of emphasis there on that aspect of who God is.
So when we go to the olive tree analogy, because that is so key, and man, there are so many permutations of how to take the olive tree. But you have this tree, and it seems like it's roughly talking about, I guess, the lineage from the patriarchs or the people of God. I mean, there's different views of what the tree is, but there's a tree, and then there are natural branches that are cut off, which I'm assuming, I guess on your reading, it would be the natural branches cut off. Would those be the Judahites, the Jews?
So in Paul's day, yeah, that would be the ones that would be getting cut off. Now, I think actually Paul is alluding to something that goes on throughout Israel's history, and that is that the tree has undergone quite a few bouts of pruning, which includes, 8 centuries prior, you've got the house of Israel, virtually all of it is pruned. I mean, you get the same pruning metaphor in Isaiah 10. You get the same pruning metaphor in, Jeremiah 15, I think, or 16. Which actually calls it an olive tree. And, in each of these cases, you have this notion, this remnant theology, where the disobedient parts of the tree are cut off, and, those who are faithful remain. And in Paul's take of this, he's saying, look, this is always the way it's been. Natural branches get cut off. And I think in Paul's day, he's saying, yes, there are Jewish branches being cut off for their infidelity, their unwillingness to obey the teachings of Jesus and to, commit to the authority of Jesus. And the thing that he adds to that is that there are others that are being grafted in from outside to supplement and further the growth and the robustness of that tree, which is something, by the way, Paul's not the only first century Jewish author that we have discussing that very notion. Philo of Alexandria talks about how God prunes his people and cuts off the sinful and disobedient people, and then he uses proselytes. That's Josephus, not Josephus, but that's Philo's discussion. He uses proselytes, people from outside, to come in to supplement and bring new life to revitalize the tree as it gets down to the root. That's Philo in the first century, writing very similarly. So this is not an uncommon. Paul didn't invent this.
So the tree, though, if we're just like kind of assigning names, at his time, the natural branches that are cut off are the Jews that he's in turmoil over at the beginning of Romans 9? The ones that
I think that's probably right. Yeah.
Okay.
I think he's talking about that. But again, the whole metaphor goes further back than the present. He's talking about how this works.
Okay. Gotcha. And then so the wild branch they're grafted on, which are the Gentiles, but I guess by implication it would also be it would be the assimilated northern tribe, now an alloy among the nations, are now grafted onto the tree. And then
the nations that are coming in who may or may not have specific, genetic material or whatever that is, that goes back to some, ancient Israelite ancestor or whatever. But the point is that from the nations, God is bringing in and grafting in these new branches. And Paul's point in this, you get the verse that introduces the olive tree metaphor has to do with two mixtures. It's a halakhic ruling, or a ruling about legal interpretation that he does, where he says, you take a little bit of leaven, or not a little leaven, a little bit of if the lump is, if the portion is, the first fruits are holy, then the whole lump is holy. And this has to do with, if you integrate the holy portion that's set aside for the priests, if that comes into contact with other dough, it automatically makes the rest of the dough holy, and it can only be consumed by the priests at that point. This is not a matter of like, if you take out the first fruits from the dough, then that sanctifies or makes the other dough holy. That first of all, that doesn't make any sense. Secondly, that's not the halakhic practice in Paul's day or at any other time. And thirdly, that would require that the way to make Gentiles holy is by removing them, weirdly. So that actually doesn't work for what he's doing. There's a really good article on this by Ben Gordon from maybe 2016. But the second thing is that if the root is holy, then so are the branches. And the idea here is that when branches are grafted into the tree, they transform. They actually become part of a new tree. They are not. They're no longer something else. They actually become they're part of the tree. And so that's the point of the metaphor that he's using, of the imagery, is that that if you cut the branches of the tree out, they're no longer branches of the tree. And if you put branches in, then they become actual parts of the tree. They are set aside. They are set. If this is a sacred tree, then the branches become sacred, which, by the way, was a ruling that was known for trees that would be dedicated. Like if you had fields that would be dedicated as holy to the temple, that would then produce like the olives for the olive oil of the temple. And that olive oil was holy. It could only be used for the temple. The question then was, well, what happens if the tree gets a little sickly or whatever, and you bring in branches from another tree from outside that field and you put them into the holy tree? Is the product that those branches produce, is that holy and dedicated to the temple, or is it common and consumable by anybody? And the ruling is that if it is part of the tree that is rooted in the holy field, it's holy.
So you were saying if you graft it on, it's now part of the tree. If you cut it off, it's no longer part of the tree. But it seems like Paul's saying that when you cut off the natural branches and they're lying on the floor, they're still natural branches. Mm-hmm. So why are they now called wild olive branches?
Well, first of all, they're not in a situation where they've grown up as wild. They're cultivated, and you can tell the difference now today. I mean, you could tell the difference between a sort of wild olive bush, with its own branches and so on, and it's not normally going to produce the kind of olives that you're going to want to, get to, make salad dressing or whatever it is you use olives for. But those they develop, right? And actually, the interesting thing is that most olive trees, whether wild or otherwise, actually develop from cuttings. They're not the sort of tree that is planted. What you do to plant a new tree is you cut off branches from a living tree and you plant that in the ground and you cultivate that, and then that grows into its own new tree. So they're not wild because they came out of a cultivated tree. These are cultivated branches.
But it's just speaking to their origin, not their, do they have a present status as, like, is there anything meaningful that they are still natural? Like, I'm thinking. Oh,
I think so. Yeah. I think for one, it means that they're more easily reintegrated. Right. Oh, okay. So if you are going to graft them back in, like, that's their native tree, right? The grafting process, just like if anybody who has like a transplant, a human who has a transplant, that person's going to be on drugs the rest of their life to keep their body from rejecting the transplant, because the body recognizes it as something foreign, right? So you have to continue to tell your body, like, no, don't kill this foreign entity in here. You'll kill yourself. These are not foreign branches, right? These are native. And so it's just much more easily integrated into the tree. I think that's the case. Right.
And also the not my people was again spoken to northern Israel, not to the Jews, which is why they're not considered in this.
They are never divorced. Judah is never divorced the way that northern Israel is. There's no place in the Hebrew Bible or anywhere else where you have a divorce like that.
Now, how does that apply to this is another, I feel like every line of Romans 11 is like controversial, you know what I mean? But it is. But what is your take on the partial hardening? Because there's, because now you're dealing with the actual roots on the ground, and Paul's saying, I agree, he's holding out hope that it seems like these Jews will be regrafted in, and he's speaking about a particular group. He's talking about his own flesh, the Pharisees, and but then he has this mysterious partial hardening, and how does that fit into the framework?
Yeah. So first of all, that's a very hard phrase to translate, because it could mean a few different things. So this is apomerus, and it could be taken as an adjective together with Israel, so that an insensibility has come upon a part of Israel, or a hardness has come upon a part of Israel. So you could read it that way. It could also be taken as an adverb together with gegonen in there, which would then mean that it's a partial hardening or a partial insensibility has come upon Israel. Or you could try to read it as sort of a little bit of both. Interestingly, some biblical scholars, go back to Cranfield in his commentary, which is generally a pretty good one. He argues for the adverbial usage, and then in his own translation, he translates it adjectively.
Really?
Huh. Yeah. So that shows you kind of how difficult that can be. My take is that it's probably best taken adverbially, so that it's basically the insensibility. There's been a sort of insensibility in part upon Israel, something like that. So that part is the basic concept. I think it's sort of working as a it's partitive in the sense that the hardening I see is both temporary and partial. So Israel there is a portion of Israel that has experienced that is undergoing an insensibility for a time, for a while. So it's something like both. And I think that the idea there is that, first of all, Paul does not think that Israel itself as a whole has in any way been rejected. So anytime you have something like this, he's referring to Israel as there's the remnant of Israel that is faithful, and then there's the part of Israel that is hardened. And at the same point, he is of the view that those branches that have been cut off or are being cut off in the present can be regrafted in so that their insensibility or their callousness can be healed, and they can then and therefore temporary. So I think both of those sorts of things are going on in that passage altogether.
Well, this kind of leads to, how do we think about modern Jews and Israelites regarding this? Are they, part of that partially hardened subsection that are they the branches on the ground, that are natural, versus like somebody from India becomes a Christian, they're a wild olive shoot that's grafted in. How do we view Israelites today in 5 seconds?
Well, I mean, as I understand it, Paul thinks that Israel, in the wake of the death and resurrection of Jesus, Israel ultimately is, sort of in the end, the people who are in Christ and who are completely committed to and faithful to the authority of Israel's Messiah. That's what he argues. That said, I think he also understands that and argues that even though that's kind of the eschatological outcome, that the remnant of people who are in Christ, that is Israel in the end. From the perspective of the judgment, when it comes to Judgment Day, that's who is going to be judged as Israel. In the present, though, there are people from Israel who are not actually included in the group that would be judged right now, if the judgment were right now, who would not be judged as Israel in that future time. But they can come into Israel and be integrated and incorporated in Israel again at that before that happens. So there is an Israel, and then there's an Israel, and they're not the same in Paul's understanding. So the eschatological, the restored Israel that is going to be judged as Israel in the future is not necessarily the same thing as all of the people who could, justifiably be called Israelite today.
But they could be part if they go into if they become part of the Messiah, yes. They're incorporated into Christ. But I guess, like you were saying with the olive tree analogy, is there a sense in which it would be easier for them? I mean, I don't know if that's the best way, because you were saying that with the transplant analogy, if it's your own body part being reattached, it's better than if someone else's body part, or is Paul kind of saying that there is he seems to be highlighting Jewish heritage in some way, and and I'm not sure how.
Well, go back to Romans 3, where, what's the advantage? What advantage is there for the Jew, he asks. And he says, much in every way. Right? Why? Well, because to them was given the very oracles of God. And, and he makes a whole list of advantages that are in place. I think, again, if I were to channel Paul for today, and that can be pretty dangerous, but if I were going to channel Paul and say, okay, transplant Paul 20 centuries, and after he gets over the shock that, here we still are, and this is what's going on, and maybe, he should have rephrased some things, because it turns out that not everybody who he was writing, who's been reading his stuff, actually had the background that he kind of presumed. Once he's gotten over that shock, if you asked him the question, I think he would still say that the person who, grows up not only learning, but doing to the best of their abilities, the Torah, keeping Sabbath, doing all those things, is at an advantage when it comes to then being able to understand and apply that to life in the Messiah once they come to recognize that Jesus is the Messiah and so on. I think he would say that's advantageous. And that, a proper understanding of the Torah and practicing the Torah in these ways actually better and more easily leads someone to the knowledge that to the knowledge of God and to the to position in the people of God. I think he thinks that. I think he says that.
I have a friend of mine who he's ethnically Jewish. He was and he's a Christian, and he looks at that verse and he thinks the partial hardening is that observant Jews today affirm the Old Testament. It's just the second part they're hardened towards. I don't know how much weight there is, but it is interesting where even on a practical level, now the more you say it, I'm like, oh, actually that makes sense. If they're kind of like already on board with God and the Old Testament and even just the expectation of a Messiah and all these things, that is a closer distance, practically speaking, than if you're talking to somebody in the Amazon who's in a tribe
somewhere. You're working
somewhere.
with someone who's part of the world from which the Messiah makes any sense.
Right.
So that's part of it. I also, by the way, and I think this should be emphasized, and this is something I tried to emphasize at different points in the book. Paul thinks that people are going to be judged by what they do. Right. So, when a person stands before God, what is the basis on which that person is going to be judged? Paul does not say, oh, you better have the right password. You better be able to, to repeat the sinner's prayer, or, you better be able to say the Nicene Creed or whatever else. He doesn't say that. He says you will be judged based on what you've done, what you do. So, if you have people, and his objection, by the way, in Romans 2 is not to people who are legalists and, focused on doing the Torah and like they shouldn't be worried about doing the Torah. No, his complaint, his argument is essentially asserting that those who proclaim the efficacy of the Torah and of circumcision and of birth as, Judahite birthright or Israelite birthright, that if they do not actually obey the Torah fully and do it the proper way from the heart, then none of the rest of it benefits them, because when they stand before God, they will be judged by what they do, not by those other things. Now, here's the question. What happens if that person actually does do the Torah correctly? Paul seems to think that person will be judged as a righteous person, and that person will be a part of the people of God. Now, he also thinks that in order to do those things rightly, that person is going to have to do it by the help of the Spirit through following Jesus' specific definition of what obedience is, which is love God and love neighbor. So, that opens up a whole host of other questions that, frankly, I'm not are way above my pay grade to answer. But when it comes down to it, if we're talking about the current day, and we ask the question of, okay, well, who, when they stand before God, is going to be judged righteous? All I can really say is Paul thinks that it's going to be the people who do right.
But they would only be able to do that by
divine help. Yeah, by divine help. Now, the question is, who then has divine help? How do we get it? And Paul spends a lot of time on that. But I do think we kind of have to come back there and rest on the justice of God in this respect, because that's where Paul hangs his hat. And he says, this is how this is going to work.
That is a huge can of worms, but maybe we'll have you come on again to talk about that. But man, there's so much that you covered, and I appreciate you writing the book and putting all the time and effort into it. This is, a long time coming of research and looking at the original sources and all those types of things. So I appreciate that work. And we'll put a link to your book and to your podcast. And man, there's a whole lot more. Maybe as we conclude, is there anything, if someone's interested on this topic, aside from obviously your book, are there any good resources that people are like, what, this is, I'm very interested by this topic. What are some good books to get started on understanding Israel, the church, things like that?
So, mine, I would put in there for sure. I think the Brant Petrie John Kincaid and Michael Barber book, Paul, a New Covenant Jew, is a good book, and is worth reading. There's a book that's coming out next year. It's not even out yet, but I've been working through it and also giving some feedback and so on, as is done in this in scholarly enterprises, that I'm really excited about. I think it's going to be one of the most important books put out in a while, and that's a book by Paul Sloan. It's called Jesus and the Law. That'll be with Baker. Should be out next year. So that one would be one for sure. I would say if you can get your hands on it, that article by Ben Gordon on Romans 11 is absolute dynamite. I mean, that is fire. Let's see. I got to think about I get asked this all the time about recommended books and all of this. And it always gets me a little bit of trouble. John Barclay's Paul and the Gift is another one that I would put up there. Sarah Rudin, who's a classicist and not a Paul scholar, wrote a book. It's more of a popular level book called Paul Among the People. That's probably worth a read, I would say. Anybody who can read Abraham Heschel's The Prophets should. Then Josh Jipp, The Messianic Theology, the New Testament, is another one that I would suggest. Matt Bates, Saved by Faith or Saved by Allegiance Alone, I believe is the title, is another one that's a fun one. There's books and resources out there. If you kind of go through those ones, that would be a good place to start. But yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Those would be sort of the first ports of call I would put out there.
Great. Well, Jason, thanks again for the time. Appreciate your scholarship on this, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This was fun.